Welcome to Garden Valley Church Podcasts. We are so looking forward to having you join us today.
Well, hi guys. Welcome to the Youth Culture Podcast. All right, guys. Well, welcome back to the Youth Culture Podcast. I'm here with Brian Bandelman.
Hi.
Brian is part of... I love it.
Hi, everybody.
Brian works with us over at Remix with the youth team, and I'm just very excited for him to come on to the podcast. We're going to be having a little bit of a conversation today, talking about the importance of the Word of God. And Brian, you're how old?
I am 56.
56. That means He's had 56 years of life.
I'm almost as old as dirt.
And how long have you been saved for?
Probably 50 years of that. I was just a kid.
Yeah, and I think one of the most amazing things, I've had the opportunity over the last little bit to spend some time with Brian and pick his brain, because there's some stuff in there. And I think one of the most amazing things about Brian, and one of the reasons I wanted to bring him on to this podcast, was Brian has really helped me to fall in love with the Word and really understand it as, you know, the full thread of the Bible, and beginning to understand why God did a lot of the things that he did in the Old Testament and how that connects to Jesus with the New Testament and us now as believers, you know, with the book of Acts still being written.
Yeah.
And so I think that I'm just very excited for this conversation. And so I'm going to be asking Brian some questions, and I hope for those of you that still are listening a few episodes in and you don't believe in God, or you're still just kind of soul searching for that, I just want to say that I think this conversation is going to become very enlightening and eye-opening. And so we just pray that you would encounter God through this podcast, and those of you that are believers, that you would maybe be able to take some of this and apply it to your life.
Absolutely.
So Brian.
Yes, sir.
Tell us about the Bible.
Oh, my goodness. So the Bible is 66 books, written over a couple thousand years. I don't remember all the numbers right off the top of my head, but you've got various different authors, different time frames, different cultures, different languages. You've got everything from, you know, some ancient cultures and ancient civilizations. You know, you've got stuff out of the time of Egypt and the pharaohs and Babylonia and Nebuchadnezzar, the Assyrian Empire, all of those things, all the way up to the Roman Empire, and following after that, people from all different walks of life and different levels of education and backgrounds. Mm-hmm. Again, different languages, different things going on, all of that coming on as inspired by God to put together a Bible that actually has a cohesive thread and you know, a logical flow to a lot of things, which again is evidence of the fact that this really was inspired by God, just not a bunch of guys getting together and doing it, because some of them are, you know, 1,000 years apart when they write.
Right. And there's so many prophecies and words that were written by the prophets in the Old Testament foreshadowing Jesus coming and being the Savior of the world.
Oh, absolutely.
And
hundreds and hundreds of them.
Yeah. And I know that in youth group, we've been kind of talking about some of that stuff about, you know, Jesus came not just with a sword, because everyone thought he was going to show up and take the king.
He was going to, you know, drive the Romans out, set up, you know, the Israelite Jewish nation or empire. Yeah. And that was way too small for what Jesus came to do.
Absolutely.
He didn't come to do a physical kingdom, a physical empire that would span a period of, you know, a few hundred years, he came and did a spiritual kingdom that spans eternity.
Spans eternity. Man, I love that so much. So, I've always heard it said that the Bible is the greatest story ever told. And now that I'm a little bit older, I mean, I'm only 25, but I am finding that it really is the greatest story ever told. And it's filled with romance and stories of murder and backstabbing, and
There's some weird things
there's some
in
weird
there.
stuff in there.
Uh-huh.
There's some there's a crazy story of the Ehud guy.
Yeah.
He kills one of the kings, right?
Yeah.
The big fat king. And he
Yeah.
ends up falling over. You're just like, okay, God, like what? What's that about? What does that have to do? And so just sitting with you and having us kind of dialogue about the Old Testament, and then that kind of setting up for the New Testament and us as believers, I think is something that's so amazing. But I think in our culture today, it's very hard for a lot of teenagers and even young adults to understand what the thread of the Bible is. And I think you've really kind of helped me to weave through that and begin to kind of understand that. But for those of you who maybe are new to the Bible, and obviously what Brian said about all the different authors, the various books of the Bible that were written, I mean, a large percent of the New Testament was written by one man,
Mm-hmm.
Paul.
Yeah.
And what do we know about Paul?
Well, we know that Paul was his ancestry, his lineage. He was part Roman and part Jewish. And so,
Which I didn't know that until we sat and talked about that.
Yeah.
And looked at the heritage.
and so he was raised according to his Jewish heritage, I guess. And so he knew the law. He studied all of those things. He was brilliant in his knowledge of the Old Testament and the prophets and the law, and in fact became one of the Pharisees, and
Yes.
and was on those boards and all of those things that you read about in some of the Gospels. And yet he was a Roman citizen by birth, which you track some as you follow into the book of Acts, and some of his things were, he was arrested and they got ready to, give him the standard beating that you might give just an average Joe on the street. And he would say, by the way, is it your custom to treat a Roman citizen by birth in this way? And everybody freaks out
Because he was Jewish, but he was also Roman.
but he was also Roman. And part of that gives him a rather unique perspective, because he understood both sides of the law, both sides of that kingdom. He understood both sides of government in that sense. The biblical, the Jewish traditions, the Jewish law, the Jewish background, and all of those things, the law and the way that the Jewish government and God was set up, and then also the Roman, which is a different thing. And you see both of those coming across in his writings.
Absolutely. And I think one of the most amazing things about Paul, in learning and kind of studying and looking at that, is that he was one of the top Pharisees.
Yeah.
Like, he knew his stuff.
Oh, absolutely.
And I think it's so amazing that there's that verse that says, to live is Christ and to die is gain, meaning everything else is poop.
Yeah.
Compared to him, which is what
Yeah.
he's saying there.
Yeah.
One of those verses talks about that too. And I think that revelation, that understanding that we can go as deep and as far and as wide as we want in trying to understand the Bible.
Yeah.
But it all comes back to the cross.
Yeah.
Jesus coming, the cross, the resurrection, and now us living as believers, that we can release that same message of hope to people.
Years ago, I had a teenager ask me a really hard question, and sounded simple, but it was kind of hard in the practicality. And we were talking about the Bible, and he said, I just don't understand what's going on. And he said, you read a book, every book has it has a plot, it has a theme. It starts someplace, you go through certain things, and and then it has an ending. And he said, I just don't know what is the plot of the Bible. What's the thread? What's it about?
Come on.
And I kind of felt for him, because in a lot of ways, one of the things we do a lot is we read the Bible because it's a big book. I understand that, but we read it in little bitty pieces, and we read a piece out of here, a chapter out of here, and a chapter out of here, and a chapter out of there. And while, excuse me, I understand the reason for some of that, I also recognize you would never do that with most of the books in the library. You're not going to go and pick out, Little Women or War and Peace or Lord of the Rings and read a chapter here and then flip over 73 pages and read 2 pages there and then try to understand what it's talking
another
about.
Book.
Yeah.
You open with the 2 towers. Wait, what?
Yeah.
In Lord of the Rings. You can't do that.
And so he said, what is the Bible really about? What's the thread? And to be honest, I had to think about it. I said, you know what? Give me a few days to process this. And when we get together next time, we'll talk about this. And what I discovered when I really stopped and started pouring through the Bible is you find that in the opening pages of Genesis, the first 3 chapters, you have the creation of the world, and you have creation of mankind. Adam and Eve, and God being friends with Adam and Eve. It says in the cool of the garden, they walked in the garden in the cool of the day. I've always envisioned God coming over and hanging out on the front porch and eating ice cream. Not, the presence of God. No, God came and hung out with Adam and Eve. They were friends. They talked. They spent time together. They walked around and, looked at the flowers and waterfalls or whatever it was. And they did all of that. And then in Genesis 3, we have the fall. And Adam and Eve introduce sin into the world, which ends in them being separated from God. And so you look at the Bible and you've got 3 chapters of God hanging out with mankind and being friends and just relationship. Yeah. And then that relationship gets broken. And from
all of those books.
So from Genesis 3:15 or about all the way up to Revelation, about chapter 20, you have this giant parentheses.
Yeah.
And if you go to the end of Revelation, what do you find? You find a new heaven and a new earth. Evil is gone. The evil that was introduced is now gone. And what do we have? We have God and mankind hanging out. Again.
And that's what we get to live in now.
Eating and doing, they're just hanging out. Yeah. And what I discovered is that whole big chunk, books and books and books and books, is what God did to undo the broken relationship that happened in Genesis 3. And we couldn't do it. Only God could undo that mess. And so God works on this giant snarl and undoes all of that with the plan of salvation and, Jesus coming, God coming and dying in our place. The wages of sin is death. In Genesis, God says, you can eat of anything you want, but don't eat from that tree, because when you do, you will die. The wages of sin is death, and they bring that death in. Only God could pay that price, because he's the only one that was no longer affected by death.
Right.
And so you get, in the beginning, God coming and having relationship with us, with me, with you.
Yeah.
And then it gets broken, and God works all of those things to undo that process so that in the end, we can again be together with God, hanging out, sitting on the porch, eating ice cream.
Yeah, I love that. I love the way that you said that, and I think that really simplifies it.
Yeah.
We also find in the Old Testament, I know we spend a lot of time on the Old Testament, New Testament, but in the Old Testament, there's a very interesting foreshadow of Jesus that we see, and it's all over the Old Testament. Like, we understand that, right? Like, through God, he used Esther to deliver a nation. Well, Jesus actually delivered the nation. We also see that Moses came, and that even though he was a part of that culture, he was actually the deliverer. And we see that Jesus came, right? And so like there's those threads and those things. But we also see in the story with Abraham and Isaac, what does God say to Abraham? He says, I want you to go up there and worship me.
Yeah.
Oh, okay. Yeah, God. And he was used to it. He went up and he gave the sacrifice and all the things. But he says, I actually want you to give your only son.
Yeah. Not easy.
No.
And
the
funny thing is that Abraham says, okay. And they load up the stuff,
for the sacrifice they normally would do.
Yeah, they did it just like normal and start walking up the mountain.
Isaac's walking up with them to deliver the sacrifice.
Yeah. And Dad, where's this?
Yeah.
Where's the sacrifice?
Where's the lamb, dude?
Don't worry about it, son. And they just keep walking up the hill. And they get there, and then God provides it.
And what's amazing in that story, and I find it so symbolic, right, is that Abraham is willing to give his only son.
Mm-hmm.
That at the moment of doing that and going to sacrifice, the angel of the Lord comes and says, stop. And then eventually out of the woodwork, so to speak, comes an actual sacrifice. And it was a lamb.
Yeah.
Spotless lamb.
Yeah.
And it's the whole idea of Jesus being the spotless lamb, being the only sacrifice that we could never pay for ourselves on our own. That our penalty is death. Right? Like as God being the father, being Abraham, and then Isaac coming in and being the sacrifice. And yet Jesus steps in, and then the lamb being Jesus. And so it's like us as humanity being Isaac, we were supposed to be pay the price. And so I just think that, at least for me, that story really symbolizes the simplicity of the gospel. But we see that foreshadow as well as other foreshadows in the Old Testament.
Over and over and over again, you see story after story or case after case, the laws in the in the book of Exodus and Leviticus and all, the laws regarding the lamb and the sacrifice and how that has to be done. And then we see Jesus fulfilling those things, walking out those things. And you have, and then Matthew says, and this was done to fulfill what was written
back then.
And Matthew brings us back and ties those things together for us in his gospel.
On that note, because I love talking about this, and I know we have just a few minutes here, but we've been doing a lot of dialogue and talking about the actual gospels and the different authors and their perspective on that. You just mentioned Matthew and him going back to the old prophetic words that the prophets gave about the Messiah and him pointing to that. Can you talk briefly a little bit about that? Because it's interesting when you read the book of Matthew and you go, oh, these things are happening. And then you go to Mark and you're like, wait, some of that's not in there. You go to Luke and it's like you're actually seeing all the different miracles laid out and describing that in John. And so I'm just curious, could you break that down a little bit?
Well, in the Gospels, we have 4 Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, written by 4 different individuals, and they give us different perspectives.
Who walked with Jesus?
Yes.
His disciples.
And so you get some of this. Now, in that, if you read the Gospels, you discover Matthew was there. You can read about his calling. Matthew was one of the disciples who walked with Jesus. He saw a lot of the different things that were going on. He saw them firsthand. He was able to talk about and record the message of the Sermon on the Mount because
he was there.
He was there and he heard it, and he, and was able to, whether he was jotting notes or or what he was doing. He was there and he was able to do that. Matthew wrote from a very traditional Hebrew Jewish perspective. Linear. He's going back to the Old Testament. He says, okay, so Jesus did this, and that's what was told there. And he's bringing these pieces in, and he's doing these things, and he's connecting the dots between what Jesus is doing and the Old Testament prophecies and the things.
That's brilliant.
Then you get Mark. Who's Mark? Where does he show up in any of this? Because, I'm reading through the book of Matthew and I don't see Mark's name listed anywhere.
Nope.
He's not there. So who's Mark and where did he come from and how does he know? Well, if you get into the book of Acts and later on in the New Testament, you discover that there is a young man that the book of Acts typically refers to as John Mark. And John Mark was a young man who originally started serving with Paul and Barnabas. And in time, they had some problems. They had a falling out, and it's possible that John Mark was immature. He was a young man. There were some things he was learning. So anyway, they had a falling out. John Mark comes back and then pairs up with Peter and becomes a disciple of Peter. He follows Peter around, and Peter teaches him and mentors him, disciples him, and teaches him. And so when you get Mark's, then how did Mark do it? Mark is recording for us Peter's perspective. Peter was there.
Because Peter was there.
And he writes it all out. And in fact, there are times when it talks even about Jesus would step aside from most of the disciples and he would go with his, what we kind of call his inner circle.
Yeah.
You got Peter, James, and John. And they kind of form this.
Who were at the Garden of Gethsemane.
Yeah.
His core. Yeah.
And so Peter is able to give us some perspectives on things that Matthew can't because they stepped away. Jesus called Peter aside and they did certain things. So Mark gives us Peter's perspective. Then we have Luke. Luke was not there either. If you read in the book of Acts, you discover that Luke gets converted. He meets Jesus someplace in Asia and joins up with Paul's company as they're doing the missionary journeys around through there. So you get Luke. Luke tells us why he is writing this. And in the opening passage of Luke and his second book, Acts, he says he's writing this book to answer questions by a person named Theophilus, which is Greek for lover of God. We have every assumption that Theophilus was a real person. Maybe that was his actual name. Maybe it was an alias of some sort, because being a Christian in those days had certain problems. It also refers to him as Most Excellent Theophilus, which was a governmental title. So that even puts him more at risk. So,
which is why he probably would have had an alias.
But Luke writes to answer the question of, tell me about Jesus. And so Luke writes to do this. Where did Luke get his information? Well, we know from the book of Acts that if he followed Paul around, Paul spent a lot of time in jail. Paul was in and out of jail a lot for his faith. And he spent some years studying, locked up, Paul did, in Jerusalem, which gave Luke a chance to stop and do some investigating. So Luke gives us, for example, a really good account of the story of the raising of Lazarus. Well, how did Luke find that out? Well, my guess is
He went to the tomb.
he went to Lazarus' house.
Yeah, and talked
You know, he went and said, you know, Mary, Martha, Lazarus, what happened tell me about this. And he was able to get some of those perspectives. You also, from Luke, you get the perspective of the miracles. Luke describes all of those. And you say, well, why does he do that? Well, you discover from elsewhere in the New Testament, his career, his job was he was a physician. He was a doctor. Before he met Jesus and walked away from whatever his livelihood, his career had been to follow Paul, he was a doctor. So of course the miracles would be something that would be very interesting to him, and he would be able to give us a fair description of it. And then we have the Gospel of John,
which is the coolest. And
it's very different.
Yeah.
And historians and stuff will tell us that John's book was written last. And it's almost as if John, who again was there,
in his older
years, he sat down to fill in some of the gaps. And he gives us an account of some things that some of the others didn't see. And in the book of, the Gospel of John, you even discover that almost half the book is actually the last week of Jesus's life, where John really pours into filling in those details and the things about that Matthew talked about. This was done. This is the Lamb. John,
the prophecy,
gives us the picture of what that looked like and how that walked out. And so, you look at all of those and you are able to put different perspectives. You talk to 2 or 3 people that all see a similar event, and you're all going to get slightly different perspectives, because one person's going to notice this thing, one person's going to notice that thing. You put them together and you get almost a 3D view. You get a much better, wider picture that fills in a lot of gaps. And that's where we get some of the Gospels.
Absolutely. That's amazing. I mean, just to sit on a lot of that and think that through. I remember when we were first talking about the 4 different Gospels, how I actually thought all 4 were with Jesus at that time. But as we discover over time, and just helping me understand as a young believer in things, recognizing and finding that this would be a whole nother podcast for another time because we're running out of time here. But that whole thought that you can view the Bible based on a perspective that you've been taught, or even something that you may pick up or believe over time. But it's so different to get within the pages and to actually find that for yourself and begin to see those pieces and actually see that, wait a minute, Luke, he wasn't with Jesus. Oh, this is an account. And then us talking about, he shows up with Paul. Well, where does that come in? And so beginning to put those pieces together. And so what I want to leave with you guys today on this podcast is, say it correctly, I guess, but I think that it's really easy to pull from other preachers, eat from other people's bread, drink from other people's wine, so to speak. But it's so different to get within the pages and discover for yourself what it looks like to actually get in the Word of God and to apply that to your life. And I think that as believers and as disciples of Jesus, it's so important that we understand what the Word actually says.
Yeah.
Not trying to get it from another perspective or another source. We can learn from other people. We can gravitate towards maybe people who know the Bible better. And those kinds of things.
Well, you can always ask questions and learn.
Absolutely. But to live your whole life based on just coming to church on Sunday mornings, Wednesday night, those kinds of things, it's so different to have that connection and that relationship to God. And I think for me personally, if there's one thing that I could leave with you guys with, it's that if you've never opened that book because you've been intimidated or scared by it, hopefully this podcast has helped you to kind of alleviate some of the fear of that. But at the same time, it is okay to ask questions. That doesn't mean that you don't know anything. It just means that you need to find other people that have maybe spent more time in discovering and actually fleshing that out as well. And so with that, whether you're an older person on the generation scale or you're a younger kid listening to this all the way through, the Bible is the greatest story ever told.
Absolutely.
So we love you guys. Hope you have an amazing day, and we'll see you in another podcast. Peace.
Thank you so much for joining us today. If you're interested in checking out more of our podcasts as they come available, please download our app in your device's app store or check us out on your podcast platform at Garden Valley Church. We look forward to seeing you next time.